Good evening to all of you joining us here in New York, and welcome to all of our guests around the world. I'm Steve Altman, Director of the DHL Initiative on Globalization at NYU Stern's Center for the Future of Management. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of our speaker series, and my honor to introduce our speakers, Wharton Professor Mauro Guillén and NYU Stern Professor Sinziana Dorobantu. Professor Guillén is the Dr. Felix Zandman Professor of International Management at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has been a member of the faculty since 1996. On September 1st, he will become the Dean of the Cambridge University Judge Business School. Professor Guillén holds a PhD in sociology from Yale University and a doctorate in political economy from the University of Oviedo in his native Spain. His research addresses both how companies internationalize and how globalization affects patterns of organization and the diffusion of innovations and crises. He is a scholar I have admired for many years, so I think we are all in for a real treat today. Professor Guillén will discuss his new book, 2030, with NYU Stern Professor Sinziana Dorobantu. Professor Dorobantu is a member of NYU Stern's Department of Management and Organizations, where her research focuses on international business, strategic management, and political economy. Before turning the floor over to our speakers, I have just two very brief announcements. First, please feel free to submit questions throughout the session using the Zoom Q&A function. Professor Dorobantu will select questions from the audience to pose to Professor Guillén. And second, we would love to welcome you back for future programs and to keep you updated on our research. So if you're not already on our mailing list, please sign up on our website at stern.nyu.edu/globalization. Without further ado then, Sinzi, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the introductions. Mauro, it's always a pleasure to see you, and it is wonderful to welcome you at Stern this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Steve for his very kind introduction.
Well, I want to ask you first about sort of how you started getting interested in globalization. You've been researching, writing, and talking about globalization for a very long time. So I'm curious, what piqued your interest in topics related to globalization, and what have been some of the major influences on how you think about globalization and its implications, not just for the business world, but also society more broadly?
Yeah, so I'm old, as you know. I mean, I graduated with my PhD in 1992. And so in the 1980s and 1990s, there were huge debates about globalization, about the fact that markets were becoming bigger in the world, that national boundaries were being erased, obstacles to trade were being removed. And if you remember, it was a time when, essentially a lot of people in business schools and also in other departments at universities were studying globalization. And I thought it was such an important and, consequential topic that it would be worth actually devoting much of my energies to that, including, of course, also the study of the multinational firm, because I think, studying that type of company is also relevant to the study of globalization. And in terms of the influences, I've tried, as you know, to be interdisciplinary. So I started reading about what not only management scholars, but also sociologists, political scientists, economists, and also anthropologists were writing about globalization. And in fact, one of the ways in which I was able to immerse myself in the topic was 20 years ago by agreeing to teach a class on globalization at Penn for all undergraduates in the university. And it was team taught with a historian and with an anthropologist. So as you know, I'm very interdisciplinary. I like to read about what people are doing in different disciplines. And those have been, the areas of knowledge that have influenced me when it comes to studying globalization.
From your broad interest in globalization that you've studied in such a sort of this interdisciplinary perspective, can you kind of distill for us the motivation for writing your latest book, which is called 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything?
Yeah, so this is a book that is different from other books that I've written in the sense that it is a trade book, meaning I was aiming at a very large audience, not just of academics, but also just at the general educated public. And I started writing the book, well, I should say, I started doing research for the book about 7 years ago. At the time, I was teaching, of course, my classes at Wharton and at Penn, including that class that I told you about earlier on globalization. And I was also doing quite a bit of executive education. And I was detecting in my students and the executive education participants that they were becoming very anxious about the direction that things were taking, right? So this was after the global financial crisis. If you remember, there was a little bit of uncertainty as to what would happen. And so I wanted to write a book that would be kind of a roadmap, a guide for people to understand all of these intersecting trends, you know, demographic trends, economic trends, technological trends, and to give them a sense as to what, in my view, the world is going to look like in about 10 years from now.
So your book focuses on several major trends that will considerably change the future. The first two are really important demographic changes. On one hand, high population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, and at the same time, an aging population in most of the rest of the world, including in Europe, in China, and the United States. Can you tell us a little bit about what you expect will happen in these two dimensions in the decade ahead?
Yeah, so, you know, population trends are very important. And I was lucky to take several demography classes when I was a graduate student. And it really, you know, shaped my thinking because every consumer market, every financial market, you know, the activities of companies and all of that, at the end of the day, they are constrained by what's going on with population dynamics in the world. So I'm not going to argue that demography is destiny, as you know, some people argue that. But what I'm definitely going to argue is that it's really important, I think, for business students and also for researchers like ourselves who study companies to take into consideration demographic trends. And what's going on in the world is something very simple, Cinzi. What's going on is that we're having fewer and fewer babies as time goes by. So this is true of Europe, of course, of Japan, of China, but it's also true of Sub-Saharan Africa. But the issue is that, of course, the decline in the number of babies has not happened at the same time. So Sub-Saharan Africa is perhaps, you know, 50 years behind the rest of the world in terms of the decline in the number of babies. And so at the present time, then we see that the population is still growing in some parts of the world, but it's not growing in others. And you refer to Europe and East Asia, China in particular, and also Japan, of course. So that has major repercussions for the future of markets, for the future of business, but not just in terms of the size of the population. And I'm sure you're going to have a question about this. But the other thing that changes is the age structure of the population. And that has huge implications for consumption, for savings, for investing, for the labor force, for everything, right? So these demographic transitions, right, that's the way I would put it, essentially will reshape the global marketplace for the next, I think, 30 years.
Can you comment a little bit on how globalization has contributed to these trends?
How globalization, I'm sorry?
How has globalization contributed to these trends?
Globalization is obviously a very complex process of change. And population changes are part of globalization in the sense that, you know, we are seeing global trends. So the decline in fertility is a global trend. The increase in life expectancy is a global trend as well. But like with everything else in globalization, different parts of the world are participating in those particular trends at different points in time, at different rates, with different degrees of intensity. This also happens with trade. It happens with foreign direct investment. It happens with the diffusion of technological innovations, with everything. But in the specific case of population trends, it makes a big difference because once again, although the global trend is a decline in fertility, you still have several parts of the world, very important parts of the world, where the population grows because women on average are having more than 2 babies, right, each. And other parts of the world where the fertility rate is below 2. So therefore, the population is or will at some point start to shrink. So I think what is important to grasp about globalization, this is for me the most important thing I've learned about it after studying globalization for 25 years. The single most important thing is to understand that globalization is not about homogeneity. It's not about things happening at the same time everywhere in the world. Globalization is most of the time not a synchronous set of processes, but rather a set of processes that happen at different rates, at different points in time, in different parts of the world. And that's what I think makes it so interesting and so fascinating. And of course, so difficult to predict at times.
So I know having heard you just say that, it's really difficult for me to ask you to just focus on the demographics for a moment and tell us what you think the implications for trade or for foreign direct investment and the movement of people means. But can you walk us through that logic?
Absolutely. So it's a complex topic, but let me just offer a very simple example that I tell my undergraduates, right? So these population changes are essentially making labor very abundant in some parts of the world, but more scarce in other parts of the world. So therefore, what one would expect is, yes, some level of migration for sure, but that's still a demographic variable. But think about trade. What could happen is that in places where there is more labor in abundance, wages will be either low or very moderate, and they're not going to grow that much. So then those locations become really attractive for labor-intensive manufacturing, for example. So then as a result, what we're going to see is, I think, more trade originating from those locations where you still have abundant labor and therefore more manufacturing. But by the same token, if we discuss another very important phenomenon in international business, which is foreign direct investment, I think there will be increasingly foreign direct investment, for example, geared towards manufacturing in places, once again, where you see abundant labor. And by the way, that could also trigger the beginnings of a middle-class market, for example, in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And that would, in turn, also encourage or incentivize foreign direct investment in the form of distribution channels and so on and so forth, self-subsidiaries, to cater to the needs of that expanding middle-class market. So the effects of demography are very, I think, important once you realize that these differences in birth rates are essentially making labor more abundant in some parts of the world, but scarcer in other parts of the world.
You mentioned the middle class just in your most recent remarks, and this is also a trend that you discuss extensively in one of the chapters in the book, that the growth of the middle class will be outside of US, Europe, and Japan, and that for the next decade or two, the growth of the middle class will come from China and then increasingly from India, other parts of Asia, and perhaps Africa too. What are the most important things to keep in mind as we're thinking about this impending change?
So the middle class is the backbone of the market economy. As you know, here in the United States, 70% of gross domestic product is domestic consumption, and most of that is the middle class. The middle class purchases branded goods, goes on vacation, wants to have a home, so therefore then needs a mortgage, owns a car, so therefore, again, they need a car loan, and they want economic security for them and for their children. They also spend more money on healthcare and on education. So as the middle class develops, then essentially the economy develops, right? So it's not that the middle class develops because the economy grows. I think it's the other way around. And that the important thing here to keep in mind is that for the longest time, the middle classes of Europe and the United States were more than half of the global market. But beginning in a couple of years from now, really, you don't have to wait until 2030, the middle classes in Asia, when you include China, India, and all of the other countries, excluding Japan, Singapore, and some other markets which are not emerging anymore, will be more than half. And, companies and brands, as you know, have been paying attention to the American and the European consumer primarily. But from now on, they will have no choice but to essentially take into consideration the preferences and the tastes of the Asian consumer if they want to grow into the future.
And with that in mind, how much do you think this is going to shape geopolitics and just the future of world order, something that you talk a little less about in this particular book, but you've covered extensively in your previous book, which is called rude awakening.
Yeah. So, yes, I made a conscious decision in this book not to include geopolitical issues, because otherwise, it would I would be trying to cover too much ground. But this particular growth of the middle class is, I think, very, very consequential for the geopolitical balance of power. So China right now has a middle class that is almost as big in terms of spending power as the American middle class. But, if things continue the way they're going, China eventually will have a middle class that is, 5 or 6 times bigger than the American middle class. I mean, that is mind-boggling, right? And then on top of that, India will have also a middle class that is 4, 5, 6 times bigger than the American middle class. And, the middle class pays taxes, okay? The middle class is the part of the population that really supports all of the things that, we have here in the United States in terms of projecting our global power. So it supports the military, it supports foreign policy, it supports everything. And so, I think it's inevitable. Unless the American population were to grow, and by the way, that would be an argument for immigration, the writing is on the wall, which is that at some point in the future, I won't be alive. China, India, some of these other emerging markets will have way more resources because they're going to have a strong middle class at the core of their economy than we have in Europe or here in the United States. And therefore, they're going to be in a position to invest in all of these capabilities and to project their influence around the world so much more strongly than today. So it's definitely going to change the balance of geopolitical power. But don't get me wrong, I don't think that's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years. I think during our lifetimes, or at least my lifetime, I think what we're going to see is increasingly this idea of a multipolar world in which the United States will be or continue to be the most sophisticated economy technologically. It will be or have the largest military still for the next 20 or 30 years. But it will be a situation in which the United States will no longer be able to impose its will on the rest of the world. For example, when it comes to trade negotiations. But the United States can play a role in terms of building alliances and therefore be influential. And by the way, if we allow me, that's exactly what the Biden administration is doing now. Something very important for the field of international business. If you remember a few days ago, he announced that a new initiative to tax corporations on the basis of the sales that they generate, multinational corporations, on the basis of the sales that they generate in different markets around the world. And if you remember, since immediately, within 24 hours, a week ago, France and Germany voiced their agreement with that proposal. So that's, I think, what's increasingly going to happen, that the US is going to make proposals, but in order for those proposals to be adopted globally, it will need to have the support of other important countries in the world.
I want to bring in a question from our audience, and that has to do with what you were also mentioning earlier, that globalization is not it's not a homogeneous process that happens everywhere at the same time, but it's really important to consider variation. The question specifically asks how much stickiness or inertia do you expect to essentially to remain after all of these changes that you observe and the trends? Like, will cultural and historical institutions as prestigious as the European and US universities endure in light of this change?
Well, inertia is a very powerful force. And inertia can be a positive thing, but it can also be a very negative phenomenon. It can be negative if it prevents organizations, companies, entire countries from adjusting, from adapting to the new situation. But the person who asked the question is absolutely right. I mean, there's always something that we inherit from the past that maybe should be preserved. But all of these institutions, including, by the way, universities, right? As you said, but not just universities, also our government structures, multilateral organizations, and so on and so forth. If they want to remain relevant, they're going to have to change. And this is also, by the way, I think really true of business schools. Let me just add one thing here about this particular institution. I think there's never been a greater need in the world for managers. Because whenever you get into these massive transformations, you need to manage the process, because otherwise, something will go wrong, right? So you need more managers to help companies adjust, to help governments, NGOs adjust. But business schools cannot educate managers in the same way that we've been doing it for the last 50 years. We need to change if we want to remain relevant. So I think that's true of all of the other institutions that we're inheriting. And yes, Europe and the United States can build new capabilities and new strengths on the basis of those institutions that have been around for a long time, but only if those institutions are willing to reform themselves. I think that's the key thing. And unfortunately, I am seeing too much inertia, especially at universities, by the way. For example, with online education. As you know, the response by most universities to online education has been, okay, let's experiment a little bit with it, but we'll do it as a sideshow. We're not going to change the way in which we do things. One consequence of this pandemic, however, given that all of us have been forced to teach online, may be that we start looking for ways to change the way in which we organize education. But I am not too optimistic because, again, universities change so slowly, right? So we'll have to see, but it's a very good question.
We have a question that builds directly on that. Specifically, can you give more examples of how business schools need to change? Or if I were to rephrase that, as you look forward to your new role as Dean of Cambridge Judge Business School, how do you see your perspective on globalization and global trends influencing your priorities as a dean?
Well, I'm not going to disclose to you my whole strategy because, I want to surprise my competitors. But no, seriously, look, I think that globalization, international business, multinational corporations, foreign direct investment, trade, all of these things that we've been talking about are going to continue being some of the most important aspects of globalization. And business schools need to be in a position in which they have something to say about them through good research, and also have to be in a position to educate future managers in such a way that they understand how those things play. And, there's one thing, Cinzi, that I really disagree with. Some people are saying that this pandemic represents the end of globalization, right? And that, the trend towards protectionism and towards economic nationalism is also going to derail globalization. And I couldn't disagree more with those forecasts. I think what we're seeing right now in the midst of all of these transformations is that the process of globalization is mutating into something else. But it's still globalization, but it's a new variant, so to speak, of globalization that we're going into now. And so again, business schools, I think, they have to embrace the world because, the jobs for business school graduates in 10 years from now, number one, they're going to be in different industries, right? At the Wharton School, 80% of the jobs that our students are taking now upon graduation didn't exist 20 years ago. The industries that are hiring our graduates, except for consulting, didn't really exist in the way that they exist today. I'm talking about technology, but not only technology, also hedge funds and private equity, other forms of finance. So business schools need to change because things are changing so fast, right? And of course, it takes us years to reform the curriculum. That's the challenge. I think business schools, unless they become nimbler, I think they run the risk of becoming irrelevant. So they need to change much faster than in the past. I always joke that when I arrived at Wharton, and that was many years ago, people were talking about the new curriculum. And I asked, when was the new curriculum introduced? And they told me, 15 years ago. But not only that, I've been at Wharton for 25 years, and we only changed the curriculum 5 years ago. So the new curriculum, that old new curriculum, was actually there for 30 plus years, right? So we need to change much faster than that. That, I think, is the challenge for business schools.
So what are the industries that you would expect, based on the research that you've done for the book, what are the industries do you expect will hire business school students 5 years from now, 6 years from now?
So look, I think on the one hand, we're going to see more of our students going into, and I think you're going to be surprised by this, into organizations or companies engaged in agriculture and manufacturing. And I say this because, look, technology is taking over those industries. And they're going to need managers to handle that. Agriculture is becoming very quickly a high-tech enterprise. And manufacturing is going to be utterly transformed by robotics, by automation. But not only that, also by nanotechnologies, so new materials, by 3D printing, all of these things. And the consequences are right now difficult to anticipate. So we need managers to essentially manage all of those changes. But let me also say something that is really important here. A colleague of mine at Wharton in the operations department, Professor Zhao, she has all of these studies about whether robotics destroys jobs. And what she's been finding for the last 10 years is that actually there's net job creation, both inside and outside of the firms that adopt robotics. Because once again, you need so many new layers of managers to handle that whole process, even after you have introduced the robots, right? So I think, once again, the first area where we're going to see job growth, especially for business school graduates, is agriculture and manufacturing, but high tech in both cases. And then the other area is, and this I'm sure comes as no surprise, is digital platforms, blockchain, the Internet of Things. So I think that part of the economy is going to continue expanding like crazy. And look, Cinzi, it's mind-boggling right now. Out of the 10 largest companies in the world by market cap, 8 are digital platforms, 8 of them. And the other 2, one is an oil company and the other one is a financial services company, right? And the same is true here in the United States. 8 out of the 10 companies with the largest market cap are digital platforms in one way or another. And by the way, since we both come from Europe, that's not the case in Europe. This is the problem in Europe. The economy has not transformed itself. So still, if you take a look at the CAC 40 in France, you take a look at the DAX in Germany, you take a look at in continental Europe, not in the UK, in continental Europe, all of the blue chip indices, still they're dominated by banks, by utilities, and by some other kinds of very large companies that have been around for a long time.
And what is your explanation for Europe's?
Well, look, I think, again, we both come from Europe, so we understand now, after having lived in the United States for so many years, the differences, right? In Europe, the lifestyle is great. The social safety net is wonderful. But somehow, not in all of the countries of Europe, so I would perhaps exclude from what I'm about to say, Denmark, Sweden, maybe the Netherlands, right, in continental Europe, maybe part of Germany, but not the whole thing. In Europe, in most countries other than those that I've just mentioned, I think the mentality that the social safety net has created is one in which people don't want to take any risks. People just are looking for a job for life. And people are not willing to fail. And that's what you need, is people who are willing to fail as entrepreneurs by taking the initiative, by engaging in innovation. I think, in Europe, unfortunately, and I in particular know the case of Spain really well, entrepreneurs try, there's plenty of entrepreneurs, but the structure of the economy and the institutions are not set up in such a way that those entrepreneurs can grow their ventures. It's really problematic.
I want to come back to a different trend that you highlight in the book, and that specifically focuses on the rise of women, who you argue will own more than half of the world's wealth by 2030. Why, can you explain for us or walk us through why this is the case, and what are the implications that this has for the world's financial systems, for innovation, and also, of course, for the world's workforce?
Yeah. So, by the way, this is the one trend, I think, that has been slowed down by the pandemic, not accelerated, meaning the progress that women were making in the labor market and with their own earnings. As you know, the unequal division of household tasks has essentially meant that now that children are not in school and people are in home confinement, and then women, many working women, to be precise, 2.5 million here in the United States have left their jobs because they couldn't cope with it all. So the pandemic has been negative for women. But the longer term trend is one in which women's access to education is improving in many parts of the world. And then as a result, of course, they are participating in the labor market. And they're following careers that essentially mean they'll have, they're making good money. And by the way, that's the reason why the number of babies is falling. Because then women, they pursue their careers, they postpone having their first baby, and therefore if they start late having babies, they don't have as many as their mothers or grandmothers had. So that's the main reason why women are accumulating wealth, because women are having better access to education, and therefore they're pursuing careers and they're saving money. The other reason, of course, is that, as you know, women outlive men here in the United States by 6 years. And so what that means is that they have more time to work, they have more time to accumulate wealth, and also they have a better chance of inheriting, right, at an earlier age. So this is really, really important. And it's going to change consumption, but not of beauty products. I mean, don't think about that. I mean, really the changes are going to be in education, healthcare, and insurance. And together, by the way, those are 35% of the American economy. Women are more likely to spend more money on education, not just for themselves, but also their children and grandchildren, also on healthcare, and also on insurance. Let me just give you an example. Women in general prefer lower deductibles on their auto policies or home insurance. And so they have to pay a higher premium for the lower deductible. And the premium, of course, is spending. And when it comes to savings, also, women do save more money at several stages in life than men. And then when it comes to investing, we can tell, for example, from how women versus men allocate their pension funds to different asset classes. Women prefer to take fewer risks. And also, they change their investments less frequently than men, which, by the way, is a very good strategy in the longer run. So all of this is going to change the financial markets. And some people are arguing, and I think I agree with them, that the increasing popularity of index funds has a lot to do with the fact that now you have more women who are investing in the markets, and they prefer to adopt a long-term perspective. They believe in diversification, and they don't want to change their investments too frequently.
Do you think we can hope for a gradual shift to long-term horizons when we evaluate performance of firms, or?
I hope so. I hope so. But there are two things that are always focusing our attention on the short term. One is the financial markets. There's no question about it, right? And especially the American financial markets. Quarterly results are so important. And yes, we've made some progress by introducing incentives for executives so that they care more about the longer run. But it's a very, very uphill kind of battle. The other reason why we continue as a society to be so focused on the short term is politicians. Politicians only care about the next election. I mean, as you know, because you draw on political science a lot, the best predictor, right, of politicians' behavior is what will get them reelected, right? Whatever they feel that is going to get them reelected, that's what they do, right? Well, here in the United States, as you know, the Congress is every 2 years. The Senate is every 6 years, so that helps a little bit. The president is every 4 years. So that's not a very long-term time horizon. How do you introduce political incentives so that we deal with the problem of climate change, which is a long-term problem, right? I mean, it's pretty hard. And again, I think we perhaps need to make a bigger effort to introduce more incentives in both financial markets and in the political system so that people and politicians and executives adopt longer time horizons.
I want to change gears a little bit because your book is so rich and covers so many different trends, and I don't want to do justice to cover a little bit of everything. You also expect a dramatic increase in your urbanization in the decade ahead, and we know from research that cities are more connected to the global economy.
Yeah.
Is it fair to conclude from that? So two things, like, is it fair to conclude that growing urbanization will further increase globalization? And has the pandemic shifted any of this the same way that it has?
So you're absolutely right. The process of urbanization is a parallel process of change to that of globalization. I mean, there's so many synergies between the two. And it's very clear that the decision-making centers of globalization are cities, like New York, for example, right? And it is hard for me to see how, even with the pandemic, that process is going to be reversed. Some people are saying that this is the end of Manhattan or the end of New York, right? Because people now are going to be working remotely, so they will leave the city, blah, blah, blah. Look, the same forecast, the same dire prediction was made in the 1970s when New York was in a deep fiscal crisis. And New York roared back. And I have no doubt that cities that like New York, which are right now suffering, will roar back. My colleagues at Wharton in the real estate department, they tell me that there's absolutely no evidence that residential prices, both for purchases and for rent, in major American cities are going down. It is true, however, that commercial real estate and office space, the price for those may suffer greatly as we continue to incorporate remote work practices, right? Because I don't think we're going back to the office 100% of the time. But look, whatever happens in the US, whatever happens even in Europe with cities, quite frankly, Sinziana, and forgive me for being blunt, is becoming increasingly irrelevant on a global scale. I mean, Europe and the US are becoming less and less relevant. And cities are growing like crazy in India, in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, where you still have most of the population in rural areas. And no pandemic will make them change their mind. They want to go to the city because they think there are opportunities there. What I think we should try to do, and African countries in particular should try to do, is to create more jobs in the countryside. And that's why I argue in the book that in the case of Africa, it's very important to have an agricultural revolution so that jobs are created in the rural areas. Because otherwise, people are just going to leave and they will want to go to the cities, and the cities are already becoming too large, right? But right now, quite frankly, I don't think the process of urbanization, even with the pandemic, is going to slow down in the world. Because again, most of the action is not in the US or Europe; it's in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia.
And because you just mentioned Africa and a number of industries that are likely to grow in Africa in the decade ahead, there's a question from the audience, from an audience member, asking specifically, do you think large multinationals are willing to take the risk of failing in Africa when they focus on the growing middle class there, or in sort of agricultural industries? Or do you think, perhaps by contrast, that entrepreneurs are better positioned to start investing in Africa? Or should we look to African companies investing there and then perhaps expanding to other parts of the world as well?
Yeah, well, look, if we don't do it, believe me, somebody else will do it. And entrepreneurship by locals in Africa, by people from Africa, it's growing by leaps and bounds. You already know, I'm sure, that Chinese companies are investing in Africa across the board. Indian companies, especially telecoms, are also investing heavily in the part of Africa, East Africa, that is closer to India. So Africa is becoming a very dynamic region in the global economy. They have a young population. They are very motivated to try to improve their lot. So they're going to be working very hard. And I think the biggest challenge will be to educate the generation of Africans that will be born over the next 10 years or so. We're talking about 400 million babies. But other than that challenge, look, they're ahead of the curve in terms of mobile money. They're ahead of the curve in terms of telemedicine, right? They are starting to have a robust manufacturing sector. There was an article in The Economist magazine just a couple of weeks ago on this point. It's like people believe that there's no manufacturing in Africa. And in fact, at a similar level of development, right? If you compare Asia to sub-Saharan Africa, there's actually perhaps even more manufacturing in Africa now. If you just compare Africa and Asia, when each of those regions were at a similar level of development. So, look, I think companies that neglect Africa are making a big mistake. I'm not saying that they should rush and make investments tomorrow, but they should at least start to learn about what's going on in Africa and pay very close attention to it. Because look, when Africa becomes, in the year 2028, now a couple of years earlier than what I predicted in the book, the second biggest region by population in the world, becoming bigger for the first time than East Asia. And remember, East Asia includes China and Japan and South Korea, very big countries, and Vietnam, each of them with hundreds of millions of people. Well, Africa then will matter because it's going to be so big, right? And believe me, companies, both within Africa and from outside, will go there and invest. They're already doing so. So if American corporations or European corporations don't do it, somebody else will do it. And if they realize in a few years from now that they should invest, maybe they'll already have missed the train.
So the digital economy and digital platforms have enabled what you mentioned, mobile money and telemedicine, but also a very strong shift towards the sharing or the collaborative economy, right? In the book, you write specifically that you believe that owning is out and sharing is in. How would you connect this sort of the trends between sort of a greater adoption or greater participation in the collaborative economy, which in certain sort of industries is quite local, with trends in the global economy?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting issue, which, by the way, I mentioned in the book, but I wasn't able to explore in depth. Look, the market economy, and that since you come from Eastern Europe, you know this better than anybody else, is based on a system of property rights. And you cannot have a market economy unless you have property rights and you have property. And yeah, I mean, the trend towards the sharing economy and young people preferring to access assets as opposed to owning them, like cars or homes and so on and so forth, I think will present eventually a challenge to the way in which the capitalist market economy has been organized for the longest time. So I think it's something to watch very carefully. But having said that, I think the sharing economy can eliminate a lot of inefficiencies, right? Let me just tell you one vivid example. 30% of the time that people spend driving their car downtown in the United States, they're looking for a parking spot. So that doesn't make any sense, right? And the sharing economy promises to perhaps help us overcome those kinds of inefficiencies.
We have a question from the audience, and it would be impossible not to have this conversation without talking about climate change. But the question specifically is asking, how do you think climate change affects all the trends that you mentioned in the book, but also more broadly, how will it affect the business environment over the next 10 years?
Well, you mean the business environment or the physical environment?
The business environment in this question.
And you're referring specifically to which technologies? I missed that part.
Question from the audience is, how do you think climate change affects?
Oh, climate change, right.
Climate change,
So, look, I think climate change is or should be a priority right now, because if we don't act, then it's going to be too late. I think business has many roles to play in that process. One is, which is happens to be really important, is to persuade their customers to be less wasteful with energy usage, with products that they purchase, and all of that. The other very important thing is that businesses themselves need to be more efficient. But the other way, and I think this is more in the spirit of the question, the other way in which the business sector is affected is that climate change is going to create a lot of opportunities for business to play a role. Now that the Biden administration is about to pass a major infrastructure package, which includes major incentives for companies to play a role in terms of changing this trend towards warming on the planet, I think there's going to be a boom in terms of both established companies and new companies, new ventures, trying to address different aspects of climate change. For example, if the economy moves towards electric vehicles, right? And so on and so forth. The really important thing to keep in mind here is that climate change is a big problem. But, you know, my approach to big problems always is, hey, that also creates a big opportunity in terms of coming up with solutions to that problem. And look, there's no solution to the problem of climate change unless businesses gear up and they play an active role. And by the way, there's no solution to the problem of climate change unless we fix the cities, unless we make them more energy efficient. Because remember, 80% of the emissions in cities, 80% of the carbon emissions in the world originate from cities. But cities are only home to about 55% of the population, and they occupy only 1% of the land. So 1% of the land, 55% of the population as we speak today, but 80% of the carbon emissions. So once again, I think businesses should be playing a very proactive role. Let me put it this way. There's a business case to be made for investing in solutions to the problem of climate change. And I think a lot of companies and a lot of entrepreneurs are going to do really well in the future, in the near future. And in so doing, they're also going to help us overcome this very serious issue.
When you researched your book, you used extensively lateral thinking. And I love the fact that when you talked about the motivation of this book was to use lateral thinking to kind of identify trends and increase awareness of these impending changes to help us, all of us, understand and anticipate the future so that we can adapt and think about what's coming in a more creative way. You even quoted Winston Churchill in saying that the pessimist sees a difficulty in every opportunity while the optimist sees an opportunity in every difficulty. And obviously I cannot help but take away the fact that you're trying to help us, by helping us understand the future, you are trying to make all of us a little bit more optimistic about it, as you said at the beginning. So again, coming back to this idea of lateral thinking, can you describe this for us and some of the major elements of lateral thinking?
Absolutely. So lateral thinking is all about connecting the dots, okay? So in other words, as you have mentioned, I discuss many different kinds of trends in the book, primarily population trends, economic trends, and technological trends. But the mistake that most people make is to look at each of those trends as if they were isolated from the others. So lateral thinking is all about connecting the dots across those trends. Let me give you a very simple example, okay? So on the one hand, now we live longer, okay? Life expectancy has been growing. On the other hand, when we reach our 60th or our 65th birthday, we are in much better shape mentally and physically than a generation or two generations ago when people reached the same age, okay? And now let me add, if we had a third hand, okay, in our body, a third trend that happens to be really important, and then I'm going to connect them all, which is technological change is making the knowledge that we acquire obsolete or antiquated much faster, okay? So look at this, Sinziana. Up until now, we have been essentially going to school only once when we were teenagers or in our early 20s, in the hope that wherever we learn there would last a lifetime. But that lifetime is getting longer now. And not only that, technological change is rendering what we learn in school obsolete faster. So if I connect all of those dots, then here's my forecast for the future. We're going to go back to school several times. So we're going to go to school first when we are young and then start working. After 15 years, we're going to realize that we need to go back, maybe using an online platform. And then we will work for another 10 years. And then we will go back to school again. And that will open up so many other possibilities. For example, the possibility that instead of having several jobs in our lifetime, so for example, I've had a job at MIT and then I had a job at Wharton, and now I'm moving to Cambridge, that perhaps I will follow, or people like myself will follow, several careers right? Because each time that we go back to school, there would be nothing preventing us from exploring something new, especially if technological change has made our existing line of work obsolete, right? So in this very brief example, what I've done is put together, right, connect the dots across 3 different kinds of trends. And once you connect them, then you see that perhaps over the next few years, we're going to see massive change in terms of the way in which people live their lives, right? It's not going to be a sequential model. First we play, then we study, then we work, then we retire. I think we're going to be playing when we're very young, then we're going to study, we're going to work, then we're going to study again and work again, study again, work again. And then maybe, but I'm not even sure about that, we'll retire. Maybe, perhaps.
So thinking, I mean, I love the fact that you're suggesting that education is going to be something that we'll always go back to refresh, because what we acquire in the first part of our life is not sufficient for a lifetime, because this lifetime is becoming longer. But one of the students that has joined us tonight is asking you if you could advise specifically on what types of new skills do you think MBA students will need in the near future to adapt to changing global priorities like climate change, and to turn toward new global markets like sub-Saharan Africa?
I absolutely do. And it's not just an opinion. It's actually based on the data, the excellent research that has been undertaken primarily by labor economists at MIT and at Stanford. And this is what they found. What they found is that the jobs that are being created in the American economy require technical skills. There's no question about that. But that is not growing. What is growing is the jobs that require social skills. What do I mean by social skills? Is the ability to negotiate, the ability to work in teams, and now the ability to work virtually, right? Those are the jobs which are eminently managerial jobs. So what would be my recommendation? Focus on the basics, because once again, you're going to have to learn, unlearn, relearn things multiple times during your lifetime. So the most important skills, and I say this, with a strong emphasis, are writing, reading, and math, because those 3 things will enable you to absorb information very quickly, to understand what's behind in terms of an argument once you can make it more abstract. So don't neglect writing. I know that business schools, for example, don't ask MBA students to write. That's a big mistake. We do have, intensive reading involved in the program. We are increasingly emphasizing communications, teamwork, negotiation skills, all of those things. And of course, math. So in other words, skills that enable you to continuing being a learner throughout your life. And as you mentioned, Cinzi, it's a much longer life than before. So we're going to have to be continuous learners for life, because otherwise technology will make us obsolete very, very quickly.
Mindful of time, and I want to switch gears a little bit, and I will be remiss if I weren't asking about your research on globalization and sort of the arc of your research on the globalization and what has changed. Back in 2001, you published a very widely cited piece entitled, "Is Globalization Civilizing, Destructive, or Feeble?" You concluded at a time that most research did show globalization to be a significant phenomenon, but that globalization was not erasing the differences between countries, undermining the nation state, or leading to global cultural homogenization. I want to ask you, what would you add to that research right now, 20 years after its publication?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And by the way, I borrowed those 3 terms, civilizing, destructive, and feeble, from Hirschman, from Albert Hirschman, the famous political economist. Look, we're going back to where we started, Cinzi. Globalization is not of one piece. It's not a homogeneous process. I mean, this is the basic fundamental mistake that most people make when thinking about globalization. Globalization happens at different rates, at different speeds. and therefore generates as much heterogeneity as homogeneity. I mean, it includes both kinds of tendencies inside of it. So I think what I've learned over the last 10 years or 20 years since I published that piece is that actually it's even more complicated than that, right? In the sense that, look, the world is a very unruly place, okay? No matter how hard we try, for example, to say, okay, everybody now listen to the same music, right? That's a globalizing trend. Everybody listen to, Taylor Swift or your favorite artist. Well, actually, technological change in the form of music streaming has produced the opposite result, right? In the sense that artists that before music streaming had no hope whatsoever of being able to market their music, now they can, all right? So, in other words, the number of songs available on these music platforms, streaming platforms, has grown to 50 million, right? You can choose from 50 million songs if you subscribe to one of these platforms. But here's the more important thing. They add tens of thousands of songs every day to their catalog, right? So some people would say, oh, that's not globalization because that means fragmentation and all of that. I believe it's globalization because actually this technology, music streaming, is enabling artists and their fans to enjoy music that before was not possible. So that's the most important thing I've learned about it. That technological change actually is globalizing, but at the same time creates heterogeneity.
And that's wonderful, it's a wonderful segue to my next and last question, which also comes from one of the audience members tonight. And that has to do with globalization and diversity. Here's the question. Globalization and diversity seem to go hand in hand. How should leaders be challenging themselves to think about the growth of diversity at global organizations and sort of their presence in more diverse communities around the world?
Well, I think business leaders, but also political leaders, what they need to recognize is that all of these technological changes, all of these demographic changes, economic changes, when driven by the market, right, they essentially encourage or incentivize the kind of dynamic that in business we call differentiation, okay? So in other words, that competition, which is the central phenomenon in the market economy, essentially encourages differentiation. And so the more global the marketplace, the more differentiation there will be because companies, because workers, because everybody involved will look for a way to avoid being reduced to a commodity, right? And so I think that's the single most important thing, that the process of globalization that we're seeing, at least now, I think encourages differentiation by companies, by workers, because otherwise you're dead on arrival, right? It's unfortunate that I don't have more time now to explain that. But if people want to continue the conversation, all they should do is just find me on LinkedIn and we can continue this conversation. But remember, globalization encourages or incentivizes differentiation, not convergence. I think that's a big mistake that a lot of people make.
And that's also one of the reasons why we shouldn't be as afraid of globalization, and as many have been for the last decade, if not longer. Mauro, with that, I would like to thank you once again for joining us and spending an hour with us this evening. It's always wonderful to hear and learn from your insights. I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the sort of listening to Mauro just as much as I did. And I'd like to thank Steve for bringing us together in this event. And with that, Steve, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mauro and Sinzi, for this fascinating conversation. To close, I would just point you again to our website. That's stern.nyu.edu/globalization for updates and future events. Thank you all for joining us today. Stay well and have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.